Okay, so today I'm going to be speaking about figuration. And figurative art is art that retains strong references to the real world and particularly the human form. So there's always been a large focus and curiosity in portraying the human figure in art. And as it was said about Willem de Kooning, for the greater part of his career, he painted non figurative pictures, but came to feel that it would be absurd not to paint the figure. What is really interesting about figuration is that there have been and continue to be so many different interpretations and approaches to portraying the figure. The examination and the study of the human form is seen across almost all art movements, from abstract expressionism to pop art to contemporary art. And in this presentation, I will show a range of artists who all approached figuration with very different goals, views, and intentions. So the first artist is George Baselitz. So after World War II in Germany, figurative painting was mainly associated with Nazi art and with socialist realist art. However, this is when there started to be a revival of German expressionism, and artists started to move back to combining the figure with gestural abstraction. So this artist was a German artist who started to challenge the conventional ways of figuration. And one thing that he started doing, which you can see in these portraits, is that he started to portray figures upside down, which would shock the viewer and would also further engage the viewer in more than just the figure itself, but the texture and the color and the form of the work. Another thing by painting figures upside down, he slowed down his own painting process and assumptions, and he made the viewer question the subject matter. So the next artist is Michelangelo Pistoletto. And when speaking about his own works, this artist said, "I believe that man's first figurative experience is in recognition of his own image in the mirror." So his works are really interesting as he creates works that include surfaces that reflect the viewer so that the viewer is physically included in the work. And this also means that every viewer has a different experience with the work. So the figurative aspect of his works are continuously changing depending on the viewer's interaction with the piece. My next artist is Jean Dubuffet, and so he created works right at the end of World War II, and he's a European artist. So during this time, there are many parts of Europe that had experienced a lot of death, poverty, and economic decline. And I think his portrayal of figures definitely mirrors the social and economic situations that a lot of people were experiencing at the time. So in both these works, the portrayal of the figures is quite crude, and the harshness is emphasized by the flatness of the picture plane and then also the way he's outlined the figures. So I think there's a really important thing to think about how the time periods in which the works are created affect the way the work is done and the goals of the artist in creating the works in specific ways. And then my next artist is Romar Bearden. And a fun fact about this artist is that he was actually given an honorary degree by Davidson, which is pretty cool. But Bearden was very influenced by African art and especially Egyptian art, which I think can be seen a lot in the structure and the divided nature of his collages. So he often spoke about the place of the Black artist and the Black community in American history, and his collages often depict and are inspired by Black urban and rural life. So another interesting aspect in Bearden's work is that they often try to incorporate an acoustic aspect to it, which will either be emphasized through the titles or the objects in the work. So within both of these works, it is highlighted through the titles with Carolina Shout and Guitar Magic. And for the work on the right, it is also emphasized through the incorporation of images of guitars and other musical instruments in the collages. So I think it's really interesting and effective to have an external element hinted at as it connects the figures in the work to the external element and creates a relationship between the figures shown and the viewer. Then this artist, his name is Leon Golub, and he uses figuration to make a political point. So his works always have a very strong political commentary, and he was actually one of the few American painters to outwardly criticize and comment on the American aggression in Vietnam in the 60s. So both of these works are done on huge, unstretched pieces of canvases. And I think that the fact that the canvases are unstretched gives them a temporary quality to them. And it also emphasizes the protest nature of the pieces. So in both these works, the figures are shown in different scenes linked to happenings that were occurring during this time in Vietnam and in the Middle East. And the composition and the relationship between the figures definitely brings in commentary about race and discrimination and dismantles preconceived ideas, which enhances the political protest that is going on within the works. So in an interview, which is seen in the book, Leon Golub says, when discussing the painting on the right, he says, it reflects not necessarily the goals of the society, but rather society viewing its strengths, how successful it is, and what it can get away with. What it reflects is confidence. These kinds of figures, in a strange way, reflect American power and confidence. This is an American presence, the projection of a very powerful society which intends to stay number one. The implications of confidence and the use of force are implied by these figures. I just thought that quote was just very interesting in thinking about the symbolism of these figures from the artist's mind. My next artist is Magdalena, I'll try and say her surname, Abaknowicz. Not sure if that's right, but so this artist works, so her works are really interesting as you have this exploration of the collective versus the individual identity. And her works are entirely based on the human figure and are only impacted by her choice of location and the figure's relationship with one another. So there's this notion of the collective in these works, and there's an emphasis on the power of the collective. While at the same time, there's this lack of identity, as most of the figures she portrays don't have heads, which is another interesting aspect of her exploration of the human form. So, and although there is this lack of identity and a collective importance, each figure is actually individualized in some way, be it through the texture of the body. No, she's not using like a mold to create them. Every single figure is unique. So in her works, you have this joining between the individual and the collective, and through this, she seems to be questioning human nature and relationships. And I'm sure you recognize this picture on the right is actually on campus. So we have one of her works, and it's just right by the library, so you can go and see it in person. The next artist is Julian Schnabel. And this work seen on the right is one of his earliest figuration works. And I thought these works were really interesting as there's a strong link between the human figure and objects by literally creating the works out of broken plates and then painting over this broken and disconnected surface. So I specifically chose these two works as it shows how the artist's approach to painting the figure has changed over a period of time. So his earliest figuration works were much more abstract and lacked detail in defining the individual who was being portrayed. However, later on, this artist created a series of portraits like the one seen on the left here, in which like the individuals were specifically identified and were the main, if not only, focus of attention in the composition. So he moved towards what I would consider more traditional portrait composition. And then my next artist is Basquiat. So his works have this combination of figurative painting and graffiti. And his works focus on evoking truths connected to the racism that is often represented by depicting the Black body as a skeleton. And I think his works are also a very emotive and energetic way of portraying the human figure. This artist name's Eric Fischel, and he used figuration as a way to talk about what was experienced but what could not be said. So his works he's got this portrayal of figures that are very realistic, and he uses figuration to discuss and reveal the hidden and forbidden stories and secrets of the American suburbs. So he is taking this world of comfort that is often portrayed through perfection, and he's making it really uncomfortable by the scenes he chooses to depict. So his works often depict sometimes very dark and disturbing aspects of mainstream American life, and are often very provocative and sexualized, which you can see in both of these works. So this artist is Sherman Fleming, and he's really interesting, and I guess it really shows the range of figuration in art, as his artworks are mainly performance art, and it's like the physicality of using the human form and the human figure as an artwork. So he says that when he does his pieces, he is really concerned with the history and a part of history that's always left out. So in his works, he often demonstrates the pressure on African Americans to appear impeccable at all times, and he discusses the exhausting effects of this. So here are two images of some of his performances, and you can see how the use of his body is really the artwork. So Sherman Fleming's works are actually a really good introduction into the next two artists who also comment on racism and racial prejudice and use figuration in their works to portray their views and protests. So both of these artists are actually South African. And the first artist is Marlene Dumas. So Dumas's works explore moral and ethical issues and questions. And what I find so interesting about her works, and especially about this work on the left, is the connection of the composition of her work to multiple well-known source images. So I know for any South African viewing this work, this composition of one figure holding another figure will immediately connect to this famous image that I've included on the right. And this image is of a young boy. His name was Hector Peterson, and he was one of the first children killed by police in the uprisings that happened in a township just outside Johannesburg in 1976 during apartheid South Africa. And this image was taken right after he had been shot and he was being rushed to hospital. And it's an image that every South African knows the story behind, and is a sort of symbol for the violence and the horrific events that occurred under the apartheid regime. So it's interesting to think about the connection that source images and inspirations can have an effect on the composition of figures shown in a work, and the effect they have on a viewer's interpretation of the work. So I was thinking for a non-South African, this composition of figures could also connect to Michelangelo's Pieta, which would bring in a more religious connotation and interpretation to the piece. So it's just interesting how different experiences can bring in different interpretations to the piece. So the next South African artist is William Kentridge, and he is very famous for his films, so I thought I would quickly play a short one for you. Okay, so Kentridge's works, in his works, he often focuses on different relationships in South Africa, from the control of politics to industry and resources to segregation and racial injustice. So Kentridge's depiction of figures in his films is really interesting, as there's a really clear relationship between the figures and the landscape presented. And it's also interesting to be able to show the movement of the figures within a drawing through the creation of his films. So his work seemed to be a combination of drawing figures and a kind of performance, um, which I think provides a very interesting aspect. And as he gets to show the movement of figures within a context and within a story. So the next artist, there you go. So the next artist is a Kenyan artist, and her name is Wangechi Mutu. So Mutu creates collages that often explore the split nature of cultural identity while referencing colonial history, fashion, and contemporary African politics. So as you can see in her works, she creates these distorted figures, and her art is very much grounded in her African diasporic experience. And then my last artist I'm going to speak about is Jenny Saville. So she uses the figure as a way to break down body norms and expectations. So her work seems to be saying that your body and your identification through your body is not always something that you can or that you need to change. So why hide that? She shows body forms that are often not highlighted as the ideal body type, and she places these figures in her artwork with pride and celebration. And through this, she's destroying the notion of the ideal body and the notion of idealization altogether. So her works explore this movement between different identities and bodies, and really breaking down the barrier of what could be identity and her portrayal of the figure. So I think with the work on the right here, it's really interesting. There's a really interesting relationship between the figure and the ground, and the interconnection between multiple figures within one that is seen. So this piece really emphasizes the fluidity of identity that I think she's trying to explore and think about through her works. So here are my references, and as we've seen throughout this presentation, and the portrayal of the human figure, this portrayal of the human figure is really approached through a myriad of different directions and for lots of different reasons, from protest art to challenging the conventional portrayal of figures, symbolism linked to figuration, the exploration of identity, and the relationship between the individual and the collective, as well as figuration as a way of exploring, recording, and discussing the current circumstances and happening. So that is all I have for you, and I hope you enjoy my presentation and learning about figuration. Thank you.